I couldn't understand how nobody was talking about this.
On the mic with us today is Hilary Heninger, founder of Smart Girls Divorce Strategy.
The research that we know and we can speak to is the very fact that it isn't about, how long the divorce takes or what the contentious components look like between the parents. It's actually the level of conflict.
As a private coach, she offers guidance to women
who might be facing a crumbling partnership.
Your ability to rebuild is going to be dependent on largely the outcome of your divorce in and of itself.
with an estimate of 1 in 2 modern-day marriages leading to divorce. For many, this journey can take a huge part of their life, leaving them emotionally and financially drained.
While it's important to have a plan for rebuilding, your best bet is making sure you get the most equitable outcome in your divorce to begin with.
Hilary is on a mission to simplify and speed up this journey.
Because the facts really do inform the outcome. And a lot of people get so stuck in the feelings about what's happening that they're kind of unable to separate those two things. But it's really important to ensure that you do get an equitable outcome.
Whether you are in a healthy relationship, entering a new one, or are on a brink of separation, after listening to our conversation with Hilary, you will never look at love and relationships the same way again. I'm your host, Ina Korobkina, founder of Jewel Branding Studios and creator of the Business in Style fashion course for entrepreneurs. And
I'm Ingrid J. Monday, aka Ms. Monday, a photographer and filmmaker and the author of the book, The Secrets of Becoming a Boss Bitch with a Heart of Gold.
welcome to another episode of the Rise Up and Fix It podcast. Welcome to our podcast, Hilary. We're so grateful that you can join us.
Hi, Hilary. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, I was so grateful when you guys reached out. I really enjoy your podcast. So I was really happy to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for being here. So sometimes relationships don't last, don't work. People enter marriages and partnerships blissed out of love, and then the relationship just starts crumbling. There are many different reasons, and as a divorce strategy expert, I'm sure you have seen and heard so many of these reasons. But if we were to boil it down to one from your perspective, is there a common reason?
I think that it would be hard to nail it down to one common reason because marriages can end in a moment, right? From one decision, be it betrayal or something else. More often, I think a culmination of a series of death by a thousand cuts. I think that while the ultimate reason that people choose to end a marriage is really varied, I think what is so fascinating is that if we want to understand why marriages are breaking down, when we look at the stats, we see almost 70% of women are filing for divorce. Now, that's not the same as being responsible for the divorce. That simply means that they were the ones who made the ultimate decision to formalize that. And so I think what is so interesting about that, and we can reflect this back on the breakdown of the marriage itself or the breakdown of marriages, in that by the time a woman has decided to file for divorce, she has contemplated this decision for almost 2 years. And so this means she has spent at minimum 2 years, very likely, going through the many iterations of how this is going to look, why she is making this decision, how this is going to impact people around her. And so by the time she makes that decision and formally files, she has already started this emotional process, this emotional unpacking of the relationship and what the future looks like. And what we see is that a lot of men experience this as feeling blindsided or not anticipating that this is actually happening for them. And so they are navigating divorce while they're also emotionally unpacking what has happened to cause the breakdown of their marriage. And I think that speaks volumes. I think we should get incredibly curious as a society about why it's happening this way, because for me and from my perspective, I think that what it speaks to is a tremendous emotional disconnect. And I don't think that often happens in a singular event. I think it happens in a slow deterioration over time. But I think that ultimately gives us a tremendous amount of insight into the patterns we see in marriages and why they functionally aren't working for many women. I think it really speaks to that lack of emotional intelligence and emotional awareness and connectedness for what's happening in marriages.
That's so interesting.
So part of what you do is you're on the end where the relationship is crumbling. This is where you step in and you help the couple or the female in the relationship end it in a smooth and calm and strategized way. Why is that important? Why can't they just hire a lawyer? Like, what makes working with you so beneficial to them?
So I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think that, from my own experience, I think what I garnered from that experience and really the gap in support that I saw specifically for women was twofold. It was one that there's a lot of conversation around divorce. There's not a lot of conversation around strategy. And when I talk about strategy, what I'm talking about is getting crystal clear on the outcome that you need to achieve, getting crystal clear on how you're going to achieve that outcome, and ultimately finding the right divorce pathway to do it. And when I talk about divorce pathways, I talk about, everything from, both of you getting lawyers and kind of, duking it out, and all the way down to, mediation, arbitration, collaborative divorce, and the family court system. I think that there is a huge gap in terms of women being empowered through this experience. Talk a lot about the emotional experience, but there is a real true strategy component to it. And I think that, second side of that there is a tremendous gap in support is helping women rebuild. You have to approach your divorce and the strategy around that to ensure that you get the most equitable outcome. In the same breath, you have to be, laser focused on how you're going to rebuild as if you are not going to get that outcome, because you have to be practical in that there are a lot of things beyond your control. And so those are the two areas that I focus on. And those are the two things that I really felt like I needed the most. And sure, you can go get a lawyer. There's no question. I think that advice is incredibly outdated, yet it is still sort of the common advice that we hear about. Does it serve you? Getting legal information, absolutely, that serves you. That's not the same as retaining a lawyer, and people often confuse that. I say very consistently, like, lawyers are tools, but they are not solutions. So you have to find the right tool for the job. And, you have to make sure that that is the best decision to achieve the outcome. But you have to know what the outcome you're looking for is first.
Yeah.
And a lawyer is not always the best starting point.
Yeah. Because when you bring up the subject of divorce, instantly what comes to mind, it is very emotionally draining, financially draining, and it is very long. So the statistic that you shared with us is 70% of women lead the divorce, make the decision in seeking a divorce. How are women more impacted by the negative repercussions of a divorce? Because I think in our conversation on the phone, you said women are more negatively impacted, and yet we are the ones that are leading the decision to get divorced.
Yeah, so I think you have to look at two sides of it. So on the one hand, women are typically primary caregivers. They are more incentivized to formally file for divorce because you can't get support payments. You can't get child support. If you have concerns over custody or decision making, or you are disproportionately carrying the mental and sort of child rearing load of your family, then you're not going to be able to access the financial resources required to do that you are legally entitled to without actually formally filing. So that could be one explanation for why women are more inclined to file. I think the other side of it is that women continue to be primary caregivers past divorce in many cases. And your ability to rebuild is going to be dependent on largely the outcome of your divorce in and of itself. So the irony is that while it's important to have a plan for rebuilding, your best bet is making sure you get the most equitable outcome in your divorce to begin with. We know the statistics. There are the financial components of the outcomes of divorce for both men and women, and they look vastly different. I mean, if you look at the stat of like home ownership, right? Women are disproportionately impacted in terms of their ability to afford a home post-divorce than men are. And that, plays into all sorts of things. The role that they played in marriage, primary parenting during the marriage, and then after. You're talking about, gender wage gaps. Like, it's very multi-layered. So I really focus on making sure that women get the most equitable outcome to begin with. That's where it starts. And that comes down to your strategy, conserving your resources, gathering information. And then the other side of that is, how are you going to rebuild to ensure your financial stability, and your ability to pursue all of the things that you want, including being able to be the primary caregiver for your kids, if that is what the outcome is.
Wow. So thank you again, Hilary, so much for being on our show. And I really think that there's a lot of advice here that you can give to our listeners. So it's really important that you are here today. So bringing it back, I just want to bring it back a little bit. So I don't know if you know, but I have 2 little boys at home, and one's 2 and the other one's 4, and they're still really, really young.
Yeah.
But I sometimes find myself looking at them and I wonder, what is the world going to look like in 20, 30 years? Are these little boys going to get married one day? And are they going to find the love of their life? Like I feel like that's every mother's wish for their child, is for them, either a daughter or a son, is to see their little one grow up and find the love of their life, and it's so sad that now we are in a state where there's so many divorces happening. And yet when you're in it, you're like, but just the impact of everyone around, it's just so, it's so devastating and so hard. But at the same time, what you do and what you bring is so incredibly important. Now, okay, so before we go into too many questions about like relationships and how to navigate through dealing with family dynamics, I want to know, Hilary, how did you become Smart Girls to Divorce strategy? What's your story?
I was married for 18 years when I filed for divorce. We have 3 kids. I had left, a really high paying job to stay home and allow my husband to build his business. And I supported him in that while also taking care of our kids. And that was a mutual decision, right? That was a decision between us. I worked on a part-time basis, but not consistently. And so when I made the decision to file for divorce after 18 years of marriage, for me, it was ultimately the reality and the reckoning of, I cannot truly be my authentic, most powerful self in this relationship. And I think that that is a deeply, upsetting realization, but I also think that it's a deeply powerful one. If you can really lean into that and recognize that once you are through this, transition period and this hardship, you really can build a life that is fully aligned for yourself. I think from a divorce process experience, I went from primarily being a stay-at-home parent with, resources and a lot of flexibility and freedom in my life, to becoming a full-time parent to 3 kids, to losing access to all of my resources, to returning to the workforce full-time overnight. And the realization of the fact that the law protects what you can afford to pursue is a very shocking realization for a lot of people. I think in one of the questions you guys sent me, it was like, what would people think is like, or realize is most shocking about divorce? And I think it, in a lot of ways, is that, divorce in and of itself really relies on a high level of cooperation. And when you don't have that from somebody who is sitting across from you, you are going to have to be sure that you have resources and information and become your own best advocate. And that was something that I ultimately had to do very quickly. And so through that process, I couldn't understand like how nobody was talking about this. I mean, I'm well educated, I'm very capable, I had resources, and yet the process itself, all your money is tied up in trust. You don't necessarily, you aren't able to agree on anything. So what do you do in the interim? There's so much ambiguity. And so it made me realize that it was ultimately a function of learning to be your own advocate and supporting other women around me, because I really just got started talking about it to women in my community and my circles that I would, meet and come in contact with. And through that, you started to realize that this was such a common experience. No two divorces are the same, but a lot of us are navigating very similar experiences, either emotionally or financially. And so it was sort of through that process that I started just sort of talking to other women and sharing the knowledge that I had, to then building, I have a digital download that is sort of a guide that's a 10-step kind of roadmap for people. And so that was sort of the next step from it. And then it was doing, speeches and going in and doing workshops and things like that. And then it was doing, or creating my Smart Girls Rebuild program, which really focuses on, career, confidence, and money. Because the reality is that it's twofold, right? You have to get through the divorce process itself, and you have to do that in a way in which allows you to rebuild. And then you have to actually go and rebuild. And so it was through all of my own experiences and recognizing like, well, if I have all of this, awareness and privilege and opportunity, and I had such a hard time, I can't imagine how much more difficult it is if, you don't have family around, or you aren't, you don't necessarily have the education level that's required to just jump back into the workforce and be able to earn a living wage, or you don't have resources to be able to go access legal information, or whatever that might be and whatever that looks like. And so it was from all of that that I was really able to recognize that all women in some way, shape, or form are going to have an experience in some way that's not dissimilar to the one that I had, albeit our challenges might be a little bit different.
It's interesting. I was having a conversation the other day with my girlfriend. She went back to work after maternity leave. She realized that it was just too much to balance watching her two children and going to work. So she decided to leave, and now is a stay-at-home mom. But now, on the topic of children, I have a question for you. And I think the reason why I want to bring this up is because I think a lot of our listeners might be contemplating this idea of, this isn't working, and how, and when there is children in the mix, because I feel like when I went through a divorce, I had no children. And so it was much easier to go through.
Very
It was
different experience.
Yeah, it was like, it's still very devastating, but at the same time, you're not thinking about children, right? So anyone that's listening right now that might be in a situation where they really have to get out, it's hell, and they do have children. What is the best way? Like, is it to do it when they're young, or is it when they're like hit 18 and they're older? Like, what would you give as advice when children are involved?
I think the most helpful thing to understand how to have a healthy divorce when kids are involved, I think you have to look at the research, quite honestly. And the research that we know and we can speak to is the very fact that it isn't about, how long the divorce takes or what the contentious components look like between the parents. It's actually the level of conflict. And so whatever you have to do to reduce the level of conflict between parties is going to give you the best outcome for your children. Look, kids get the short end of the stick in divorce. It's just the reality of it. And it's a really harsh reality, if we're honest. I mean, watching your kids navigate something that you ultimately know is going to make your life better. And let's face it, their experience is not yours, right? They're not going to see the same perspective that you have, because from, their perspective, their world has fallen apart. And from your perspective, you might think like, wow, this is my ability to build the life that feels aligned for me. This is my ability to find, partnership or love or support or whatever that might look like. But realistically, their, priorities are going to be very different than yours. So I think it's working with, therapists or working with, parenting coordinators or somebody who could help facilitate the least disruptive component possible for your kids. But ultimately, it's going to come down to your ability to navigate a functional relationship with their other parent. And you don't have to like them, quite truthfully. Like in many cases, there is a lot of, distrust or hard feelings that occur through divorce. I think that love or consideration is kind of the highest form of love. And so you can consider their parent and also have your own needs met. They're not mutually exclusive. But I think ultimately it's going to come down to whatever allows you to have the least amount of conflict between you and their other parent is going to be what's best for your kids.
That's great advice. Thank you. To piggyback off of Ingrid's question, if someone is in a relationship right now, whether they have children or they don't, and they're starting to have doubts about this relationship, what can they do now to start protecting themselves, knowing that they're eventually heading towards divorce or thinking about divorce?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there are two things, and this is where we get back to that conversation of hire a lawyer, right? And I sometimes think that is the worst advice in many ways because it really doesn't, having legal information or legal representation doesn't necessarily give you an advantage. Having information in general gives you an advantage, absolutely. I always say your two most important considerations at the beginning of a divorce are information gathering and resources. So I actually have a digital download. It's super concise, very affordable, and I intentionally made it cost effectively because one of the things that you need is a broad base of information about a lot of different things, from financial disclosure to how to manage or find a lawyer, how to build a parenting plan, how to negotiate. And that's a great starting point for people. Like print it out, put it in a binder, and literally go step by step through it, whether you're in the contemplative phase or whether you're actually in the midst of it. And I think the other piece is resources. You will be so limited in your ability to navigate a divorce and or negotiate if you do not have resources. And as much as the law might say that you are entitled to half of the marital assets, or you are entitled to full transparency on what the, financial landscape of your life looks like, that largely relies on a high level of cooperation from the other party. And if you have somebody who chooses not to be cooperative, you're going to need money in order to force their hand to provide those things to you. And so, for myself, going from like primarily being a stay-at-home parent to returning to the workforce overnight, I really largely relied on my retirement accounts. That was how I funded my divorce. I mean, I don't know what options you have when all of your money is tied up in trust or people liquidate accounts, or, you go from sharing a six-figure income to legitimately being responsible for all of the bills in a new household, and you're making, $40,000 a year or $50,000 a year. Yeah. The reality of that is going to mean that you might enter into agreements in your divorce and negotiate in a way that you're not going to get the best outcome because you're coming from a place of desperation. And so having access to resources and gathering information are the absolute two most important things. Hiring a lawyer, retaining a lawyer is one of the most significant financial decisions you will make in divorce. You cannot make that decision without clear and full transparency on your ability to actually follow through with it.
When we decided to go through divorce, my ex and I, everyone right away, first thing said, you need to go hire a lawyer. And I remember going, to sitting down with this lawyer and then, discussing the initial conversation is free. And then you find out like it's $5,000, the first retainer. And then you have to go,
yes.
I just could see where this was going to go. And I remember thinking, is this really the right way? And I think that like for listeners, listen, like no one's situation is the same, but if you have some way of communicating with your partner, and though we were so angry at each other, instead of going that way, which could have been so expensive, we decided to go out for dinner. And I did that purposely because I knew that if we were in an environment where there was a lot of other people around, maybe we could have a conversation and try to hash this out. Because to me, I thought like, why don't I do this first? And if it doesn't work, then I'll go the lawyer route. But if we could have this conversation in this space, maybe we can hash things out and move on in an easier way. Because in reality, when you want to separate, you really just want to separate. Like, you want to go, you know, like, why bring all these people? Because all of a sudden now it's going to be 5 years. You're still dealing with this person trying to negotiate when all you wanted to do is move on. Also, on the topic that you just said about retaining information, one thing that I thought I wanted to mention is that obviously, like, when you're in the relationship, it's much easier to, you know, to go online and get a copy of his bank statements or figure out, right? As soon as you as soon as you say, I want a divorce, the probability of your partner like deleting you from all these accounts is probably going to happen. So like you said,
and the same happens with the lawyer, right? As soon as you introduce a lawyer, you potentially inflame an already very delicate situation. And so you have to be very mindful of how you introduce that aspect, and, you know, where you're at in the process. It's funny, like with lawyers, and going back to your observation of your own experience on the amicability piece, people being amicable doesn't mean that they don't have disagreements. Doesn't mean they don't, you know, struggle to come to an understanding. It means that people are solution focused. It means that they're willing to have the uncomfortable conversations or bring in people who can support them to have those conversations to get to a resolution of some kind. That's what being amicable means. You know, we have this notion of this like sort of Gwyneth Paltrow conscious uncoupling amicability that I don't think a lot of people can relate to. Like, we're not going on vacations with our exes. But right, like, and so so people have this like pendulum swing of like, we're either amicable, where, you know, we send each other, you know, happy birthday messages, or it's like War of the Roses, and there's not a lot of in between. And realistically, I think for a lot of people, you know, I come from a high conflict divorce experience, so mine is going to be very different. Interestingly, though, you know, a lot of that fire dies down once you reach financial agreements and then parenting agreements. So there's kind of a method to the madness for even your strategy, right? If you have a highly volatile situation, it's not always, you know, kids and finances. It's often one or the other. And so I think that how you approach even that problem solving component is going to take into account, if you know that, you know, finances are particularly volatile with your ex, then maybe you focus on your parenting component first, and then you deal with the finances second, right? You're trying to like get momentum on these easy wins or the things that you know you can come to an understanding on. But I do think, like, you know, there are a lot of divorces that they can be mostly amicable. I had one couple reach out to me one time who I worked with because they were very intentional about being amicable, and they had children, and we worked together, which was a fascinating experience for me. But I think for the most part, you know, you have people who are amicable, and that doesn't mean that they don't have conflict. It means that when they have conflict, they're able to recognize that they need additional supports. Now, what supports are going to get you the outcome that you're looking for, right? And then if you go to the other pendulum swing side of it and you look at the high conflict side, your divorce pathways are going to look vastly different. If you have a high conflict, you know, co-parent or ex, you're going to want to make sure that you choose divorce pathways that are not ambiguous. And I talk a lot about this in the digital download, and I talk about this with my coaching clients. But what I mean by that is there are certain divorce pathways that give you a very ambiguous outcome, or they have the potential for an ambiguous outcome. Meaning, if you decide to just duke it out with two lawyers, you have no idea the ambiguity around how much that's going to cost you. Huge. Right? How much is that going to cost you? Ask any lawyer, anybody who's been through it, they'll say every time, I can't really give you a number.
But we'll take a retainer.
Right. And you're like, can you imagine being like, I want that house. Like, the end goal is I want that house. And a builder saying to you, well, you know, it could be anywhere from like, you know, $500,000 to $4 million. Like, would you build a house with that person? No. Like, but we do this all the time with lawyers. And like you say, yeah, you're like, here's a $5,000 retainer. And I always say to people, ask the question, what percentage of this does this represent of my total cost?
Yeah.
If they can't give you a ballpark at all, then you need to say, awesome, then it sounds like I need to go on an hourly basis because I can't afford that kind of ambiguity.
Yeah,
And
that's
the
great. That's
same is
great advice.
said for, mediation. If you have a really high conflict or low character person sitting across from you, you're going to go into mediation. And at the 11th hour, and I have seen this, they're going to back out of it. You've just spent $14,000 mediating everything. And at the 11th hour, they're like, you know what? I've changed my mind. I talked to somebody and they said, you shouldn't be getting this. I'm really resentful in this moment. I'm realizing how much this is going to cost. So then you say, okay, well, I'm going to do mediation with binding arbitration because then at least I know that I'm going to get an outcome out of this. It's not going to be for naught. Plus, it incentivizes both parties, right? If you know that the decision is ultimately going to be out of your hands at the end of the day, then you're much more incentivized to find a solution together that you both have control over than just putting it out to like hopes and dreams. And the same is true for family courts. Family courts are highly ambiguous. You have no idea what that outcome is going to look like. You have no idea how long it's going to take. You have no idea what that cost is going to be. Who you're sitting across from is going to dictate largely how expensive and how long your divorce takes. So if you know that this person is low character, if this person, lacks integrity, if this person is resentful and angry, don't choose divorce pathways that allow them to weaponize that system itself.
So whether a divorce is amicable or not, why do people choose to come to you and how do you help them, Hilary?
Yeah, so I think regardless of whether or not it's amicable or high conflict or somewhere in between, people typically come to me for three reasons. And it's, a consistent pattern that I observe with clients. And that's that, they are either stuck, so they feel like they don't have any options. They're lost. They don't necessarily know what their priorities are, or they're confused, which means they don't know what their next step is. And those are the three things that we really will go through in a coaching session. And, people think that they come to me for answers, but largely they come to invite the questions, right? Coaching is ultimately somebody who is able to sort of hear what someone's experience is and where they feel they're at, and then invite the questions in that lead them to those solutions. And that is really what I focus on, is kind of figuring out what are your options? What are your next steps? What are the priorities that you want to focus on that you're getting lost in the chaos and the overwhelm and you've kind of lost sight of in that? I think if I were to give somebody or if I were to focus on the one thing that I see create some of that confusion, is that a lot of women come to me with the confusion or the lack of understanding around the fact that, somebody's emotional experience or feelings around what you should or shouldn't receive in divorce shouldn't inform legal entitlements. And so how somebody feels about the outcome of divorce is really uncorrelated to typically what the legal entitlements are for divorce. And so a lot of women will come to me, talking or speaking of an experience of, well, they feel like I shouldn't receive this because I've been a stay-at-home parent, or they feel like I didn't contribute in the same way to the relationship. And I often step back with, your confidence level in divorce, your ability to recognize your own value, your own self-worth, your own contribution to a relationship, whether you can quantitatively measure that or not, is irrelevant to what the outcome should look like. And so when I talk about before, in gathering information and having resources, a large part of that is so that you can take the time to really understand how the law applies, so that when you're feeling that, lost or stuck or confused, you can kind of hit pause and go back to like the facts, because the facts really do inform the outcome. And a lot of people get so stuck in the feelings about what's happening that they're kind of unable to separate those two things. But it's really important to ensure that you do get an equitable outcome. And so part of my job is to support emotionally, the other part of that, though, is to remind people, and from a strategy perspective, you know, what are your priorities and how does the law support what you're trying to achieve in this?
That's great.
Very valuable information. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We're grateful that you could join us on our podcast. I want to leave you with one last question, if I may. Having seen what you have seen, and in working with different clients, and we've spoken about divorce and separation, based on what you know, what is the one thing that you wish people knew as they enter a relationship? And what would you advise people to consider as they're entering a relationship?
So if I were to give either my previous self advice, as I tell my children, if I were to give anybody advice who was, entering a relationship, I would say observe how their parents' dynamic is. I think that if you really want to understand how somebody views traditional gender roles in a relationship, how they view money, how they view their participation in child rearing and family dynamics, I think all you have to do is go spend time with their parents. So, does the mom go into the kitchen for Thanksgiving and coordinate 15 different dishes for everybody while he sits and watches football? Does the dad, come in and make sure that the, grandkids are played with while she is managing, making a meal? Or is it vice versa? Is he in the kitchen managing a meal and she's out entertaining and spending time with all of the family that's there? How do they speak about each other? When they talk about how they spend their weekends or their time together, do they look forward to, your mom and I or your dad and I are going to go do this on the weekend. We're really looking forward to that. Or do they, make comments about, oh, your dad wants me to go do this with him or your mom wants. I think that how we observe people's family dynamics gives us so much insight into what the expectation is for how our family dynamic might look. And that's particularly true when it comes to, if we're wanting to have children with somebody, if we're wanting to stay home, or if we're wanting to work and, provide childcare for our kids. Like, I just think it's so insightful because it will give you so much information about their expectation of what a family unit looks like, how it operates, and how all of those responsibilities, including money, are divvied up and allocated between both parents.
Oh my God,
normal to them.
That is amazing.
Right? And
I had this like light bulb go off. I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense.
It's so true. Like, it is so true. It is so true. My ex-boyfriend, who I love dearly, he a wonderful human being. He was a big part of my divorce, which is a whole other story. But he helped negotiate part of my divorce, which again is a whole other story. But I remember going and visiting his family and seeing how his parents interacted, and it was just so insightful, right? It tells you so much about what they expect and anticipate, and not in a negative way at all. But I just think it's so eye-opening because so much of what we believe and anticipate and expect of one another is subconscious. It's just these beliefs that we've never really talked about and we've never really explored and unpacked. We just kind of assume that we all see the world the same way. And then you go through divorce and realize, like, oh, wait, he only enjoyed me being at home when he benefited from that. Or do you know what I mean? Like whether or not somebody really values something will be so clear and apparent to you. And so I just think it's so eye-opening and it gives you so much insight.
Very, very insightful. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for everything you do to help women through this journey. It can be very, like we said earlier in the podcast, very lonely, very exhausting, expensive. And so we're glad there's people out there like you who's sharing your expertise and guiding women with the shining light on this really dark and exhausting journey. So thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
And can you plug, what's your website?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at Smart Girls Divorce Strategy. You can find me on my website, smartgirlsdivorcestrategy.com. I do one-on-one coaching, obviously, which is really great if you are feeling like really lost or stuck or confused about next steps. I have a digital download that people find incredibly helpful because it's just like a great starting point no matter where you are in the journey. And then I also have Smart Girls Rebuild, which is really about rebuilding like your confidence, your career, and your finances.
Wow.
Amazing.
So that's amazing, Hilary. Thank you so much for being our show. So that wraps up another episode of the Rise Up and Fix It podcast. Please like and subscribe to our show. And and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or anything, or you'd like to ask about our guests. Scroll down and you'll see all the links below. Until next time, thank you for listening and watching. Bye. Thank you, Hilary. If you enjoyed our interview today, please share and like it.
And if you have a unique story on how you are creatively engaging with the world, we can help you share it in a multitude of different ways. We are experts in crafting stunning photos, videos, and compelling narratives. Our mission is to make you and your brand stand out.
Please visit our website, www.riseupandfixit.com, to learn more and to connect with us.